This is a little different for me. I'm used to walking in the field, not standing in a podium in front of people with 3 screens around me, so we'll make it work. Thank you all for coming. I think some others are going to be drifting in here. I'll just talk about a few general things regarding citrus in Arizona. Any Arizona natives in the crowd?
Almost.
Almost. Well, like Anton mentioned, my family's been here for a long time, and we actually came from my great-grandparents came from the town where Jesus, the previous speaker, was born and raised, Magdalena del Quino, Mexico. So we've got a lot of history in the Southwest. And we've been farming, well, my father was farming in the late 30s in Mesa, Arizona, and then we moved out to our current location out in the West Valley, a place called Waddell, in the mid-40s, where I was born and raised, and I'm fortunate enough to still live there, in amongst the burgeoning metropolitan area of Surprise, Arizona. But there's still some agriculture in the area, and it's kind of nice to still be able to be producing. Like Anton mentioned, I have leased the old University of Arizona research farm and now operate it as a private, hopefully money-making venture. And we'll probably get into a U-pick operation on that farm this season. There are over 80 varieties of citrus on that farm, so it's quite fascinating. It's not designed as a commercial farm, of course, with research in mind. When it was put together in the mid-80s, the university had just sold their research farm in Tempe, where this big mall is over here by I-10. That's where the old U of A research farm used to be. But citrus was an important part in Arizona agriculture back through the 40s, 50s, and the 60s, and kind of peaked in the late 50s through the mid-60s. And there were 8 or 9, at one time I believe there were 9 what we call packing sheds or packing houses to handle citrus produced in central Arizona, and there were a couple in Yuma. And through the 50s, more citrus was planted in the Yuma area until peaked out at, I mentioned, in the mid-60s, let's say in Maricopa County. By then, Yuma County had surpassed the acreage in Arizona for citrus. And the trend was to move to Yuma. Water was cheaper, land was cheaper, and that's what's driving farmers is the bottom line, not because we want to do it. Citrus was started in Arizona in the late 1800s. Like some guys actually were trying to avoid urban sprawl in Southern California. They came to Arizona and planted some navel oranges and got started over here. We have a fairly decent climate for citrus, hindered only by our threat of frost in the winter. So we can grow just about any kind of citrus here if we're mindful of what frost can do to us in the winter. Of course, citrus was one of the 5 C's of Arizona that they always bragged about in the tourism brochures and what have you, of cattle, cotton, citrus, climate, and copper. Copper's almost gone, so we don't hear too much about it until it flares up on the international scene. And then there's some issues with copper. But most of these, especially the agriculture entities of citrus and cotton, are on the wane in Arizona for various reasons. Cattle is real strong. There's a large dairy industry here, and the beef industry is quite strong in Arizona still. Well, let's get on to our slides. If you're going to grow citrus in Arizona, you have to make one major decision. And throughout my years with the university, I'd always get asked the question, what's the best citrus for me? And I'd tell them, I don't live with you. I don't care what you grow. You can grow whatever you want. So the title of my first slide is, plant what you want to plant. Grow what you need to grow, whether it's something you want to put on your table as an ornamental, such as Buddha's hand or something like that, or you want to make candles out of the oil from citrus, or you want to eat citrus, you want to can citrus, you want to have it as a shade tree to drink your Mai Tais in the afternoon under, whatever. You make your decision based on what your ultimate goal of that tree in your yard is going to be. And from then on, the world is yours, because there are a lot of options. Next slide, please. Of course, all citrus is grafted. All commercial citrus is grafted. That's done, of course. You guys are all plant people. You know what grafting is all about. Anybody not know what grafting is about? Okay, grafting is something that you're all aware of. It's done for several reasons. And the big reason is you can choose your rootstock fruitwood compatibility issues and get beyond those. And you choose a rootstock for several different purposes. It has resistance to drought, disease resistant. It promotes the size of the tree, or inhibits the size of the tree, whichever rootstock you choose, and inhibits fruit quality, especially fruit quality. So these are important things that the scientists of the citrus industry throughout the world have worked out. But with grafting a plant, you always have to be cognizant that the parent plant, which is the rootstock, is going to continue to grow. So that involves pruning issues. You always have to be cognizant of what is the fruit plant and what is the rootstock part of the plant. And you have to keep all the suckers pruned from the rootstock. We'll touch on that a little bit later during pruning. Please, next slide. This is kind of a worn out old slide that I've had for many years, but it just indicates a few things you need to consider after you decide what kind of tree that you're going to use is where to plant it. You can't even see that next to on the left there, but that's supposed to be a house. You don't want to plant a huge tree in a small area. You get issues with where's the roots going to grow, where's the tree going to grow. You can get around that by buying dwarf trees, or you can get around it by planting the tree in a compromising location and prune it for the rest of its life, or your life as long as you're living in that house. But that is a consideration. Location, because you have to know how big the particular tree you're going to choose is going to get in its mature state. And I think that's pretty common knowledge, but a lot of people kind of forget that. It's amazing what we see out there. Next, please. You should be aware of your soil type. And this is not necessarily to scare anybody away. It's just as a gardener or a person that's going to grow a tree, this is going to help you in the long life of the plants that you have in your yard, primarily in the arena of irrigation and nutrient passage through the soil. So there are a couple of types of soil types here. We have a large gamut of everything in between. But typically there's a sandy soil that has a lot of sand in it, doesn't hold water and nutrients very well. A perfect soil would be a loam with equal parts sand, silt, and clay. And another soil that has a lot of clay, certainly more sticky, moisture and nutrients don't move through that soil. And then there's that wonderful thing we have in the central Sonoran Desert called caliche, which is an extremely difficult to penetrate clay. And if you have that, you'll know it, because when you dig in your ground, it feels like digging in concrete. But if you get it wet, it still feels like digging in concrete, just wet concrete. It's very, very tough to get rid of. So you have to either dig it out and excavate it and get rid of it, or punch holes in it. And it's kind of a tricky little devil because it can be in layers that are very thin. You hardly even notice it. It's spotty. Other times it can be quite thick. It can be close to the surface. It can be deep down to 4 or 5 feet. It's all over the place. Hopefully you don't have it in your yard when you're trying to plant any kind of a tree or plant that's going to have a deep root system. Next slide, please. This illustrates how water moves through the different types of soils. Real basic stuff here, but some people don't really think about this when they're irrigating, and irrigating or watering trees, especially citrus, is the most critical thing in our desert environment. But water shoots through sandy soil like that columnar illustration shows you, and loam holds it so it spreads out, and clay really holds it so it spreads out more laterally or horizontally than a clay or a sandy or a loam soil. And caliche just acts like a pot. Water won't go through it at all. You have to, like I mentioned, punch through it. Okay, next please. As I present my talk, we're going to go through little segments, and then I'll stop and ask if there are any questions. And when you see a photo of a fruit like that, that means it's a break between a segment. Any questions so far on some of those basics about planting? Okay, good. Move right along. Lots of varieties, of course. This pretty well covers all the varieties, but when you get into each one of these categories, which we will in a second here, it really opens up a big, big arena for you to play in, depending on what you want. Like I mentioned earlier, lots and lots of choices, and most of them should do okay. Here we've jumped to navel oranges, and navel oranges is an orange that has a navel, which is actually a rudimentary fruit growing in the bottom of the orange. And it's the only type of orange that has that. Some of the other ones have indications of auxiliary fruit in there, but it's not really like a navel orange. So next time you cut a navel orange, if you really look at a fully developed navel orange, they will have a secondary fruit growing in the bottom of it.
All the other navel oranges are spin-offs from that original Washington navel. And they were developed through bud sports or limb sports. Bud sport would be a bud that somebody has taken, grafted onto another tree, and it grows differently than the tree that the bud was taken from. So that's called a bud sport. A limb sport is on the mother tree. You have a fruit or leaf structure or something that's a little bit different, or maybe the fruit looks exactly the same, but it ripens 3 weeks earlier than the rest of the fruit on the tree, or 2 weeks later. Then you pull that off, and that can be a new variety of navel. So all navels are from the parent Washington navel. Some of these are pretty obvious in their times of maturation and fruit size and things like that. It takes a little study to learn what they're all about. I won't get into that. But we'll point out that the Cara Cara is the only pigmented navel orange, and it came out of Venezuela. And it is truly a pink fruit, and it's quite popular. People eat it and say, oh, this tastes really, really good. Well, let me put a blindfold on you and put you in tasting these other fruits, and they can't tell them apart. The human eye and the human brain interact together to trick the taste buds. It's like red grapefruit. You'll taste a red grapefruit and it tastes a lot different. And sometimes, in reality, when you test it chemically, it's not that much different. But the red brings out a different flavor. Not saying that they're all identical. Believe me, they're not. But a lot of times the eye is tricked. But the Cara Cara is becoming really popular because of its pigmentation. Personally, I don't care for the taste. It does taste a little different than the rest. Okay, next one, please. Sweet oranges. There aren't too many sweet oranges that are popular. You know, we always talk about Arizona sweets. Well, really, the only sweet that's an Arizona sweet is the Diller sweet. Diller was a farmer near the neighborhood of Northern and 7th Street, 15th Street, somewhere in there. And they found a branch on a tree that seemed different. And so they pulled it off and studied it, and in the 20s, they convinced the scientists of the citrus world that it was a true different variety. So they got their name applied to it, and it's Diller. It's a nice fruit, but it's typically a little bit small. The big ones grown in the area are Trovita, Hamlin, and Mars. But not many sweet oranges. That is an orange that's nice to eat because it has a lot of sugar, but it's not good juice orange unless you drink the juice right away. The juice from navels and these sweet oranges, because of the sugar content and the other chemical makeup of the juice tends to degenerate rapidly. In a couple of days it won't be any good. Valencias, which are another type of sweet orange, are the oranges used around the world for juice, and they don't have that problem because of the acid content in the juice, but they don't taste nearly as good as these other juices. So sweet oranges are used for a table fruit or a fresh fruit and juicing if you consume the juice soon after it's made. Next, please. Now, a couple of Valencia varieties that are common in this area. Campbell was the one that was used typically, but Linda, Midnight, and Delta are fairly new ones. Investor relatives in the last 30, 40 years, something like that, have come onto the market. And once again, these are the juice oranges that are used only for juice. They're not that good to eat unless they're pampered really well and the fruit is left on the tree until late in the season. Then they develop a lot of sugar. But the Valencias are the juice oranges of the world, and typically none of these varieties are grown in Brazil, which is the largest juice-producing country in the world. I think the one down there they typically use is called Pera, P-E-R-A, but we never see them growing around here. Different growing conditions down there than in the Saharan Desert. Next, please. Pigmented or blood oranges are fun to have. Typically, we advise people, if they're going to do blood oranges, to stick with the Moro. But in my history, I have found that not to be true, so I don't advise people to go with Moro. I tell people they need to go with a Tarraco, which is a larger orange and has a better flavor. Well, once again, we're getting down to flavors. What's good to me might not be good to you. The Sanguinelli is a much smaller fruit, colors up consistently, has a real strong raspberry flavor. And the Ruby is a nice one too. The trouble with blood oranges is the consistency of the color. If they don't get the right sequencing of cold and warm, cool nights, warm days, they don't color up very well. So that's the primary reason why those varieties of oranges aren't grown commercially in this area, and never were. There were a few growers that tried them through the years with Moro, but you sell blood oranges because they're dark, deep red, hence the name blood. And if they're not that way, why grow them? So commercial growers gave up on it. But they're fun to have. They're great in salads and drinks and just have around, because if you get the colorful ones, such as the Sanguinelli or the Ruby, that are consistently colored, they are fun to have. Okay, next. Mandarins are sometimes and sometimes not considered oranges. The word tangerine is used only in the United States for mandarins. The rest of the world uses the term mandarin. And tangerines came about because most mandarins were grown and shipped grown in North Africa and shipped out of Tangiers. So that's just a derivation of the word Tangiers. Somehow it got into tangerines. So Americans are the only ones that use the term tangerines. The rest of the world uses the term mandarin. The clementines are the ones you see in the store that are small and easy to peel and very sweet. A little history on that. The best tangerines in the world are grown in the Mediterranean region of Italy and Spain, and they were becoming quite popular in America 10, 12 years ago or so, and shipping a lot of them in here. Well, they hit the market about the same time as California navels do. And parents with small kids started to really love these clementines because they're easy to peel and they're small. Kids struggle with peeling a big old navel, and it's too big. They can't eat all of it, so some of it's wasted. So the clementines really caught on in America. We like things simple. So we like things that are easy to peel, seedless, and sweet. So it really kicked the California navel guys' rear end for several years before they started to change over and start to plant more clementines. And then something happened. One of the most deadly diseases of soft fruits in the world is the Mediterranean fruit fly. So they started finding fruit fly larvae in some of these tangerines in Ohio and Michigan and what have you, under federal inspection in the grocery stores. And of course, all the fruit growers of the United States, from peaches to figs to oranges to grapefruit and everything in between, became quite alarmed and go to the government and say, hey, protect us. These Spanish guys are shipping in live larvae in the fruit of Mediterranean fruit fly. Well, the American government got on the bandwagon. This is the Department of Agriculture, and under the Department of Agriculture is APHIS. I'm sure you're all familiar with APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. Those are the guys at the borders that will stop you and take all the fruit away from you and give you a big fine for importing fruit. They stopped immediately shiploads of Spanish tangerines coming into the ports in Florida and the Carolinas and New Jersey and New York. And so this had been a very profitable business for large citrus industry in Spain. So all the Spanish growers and packers and shippers called their president and said, we got a problem here. So he called George Bush and said, President Bush, we do have a problem here. We've been helping you guys in the Middle East with your war effort. Can we do something about this tangerine thing? Oh, I think we can work something out. Within about a week, the ships were coming again. Now, they did make some changes. They did change the shipping protocol. What was going on was the ships were being slack and they weren't keeping them cold enough to kill the larvae in the fruit. You can ship dead larvae, but if you find live larvae, it's a bad problem. But a little political pressure there changed the situation very, very rapidly. Clementines are hard to grow in the desert. They're doing okay in California. They're cross-pollinated to get real seedy, so you have to keep them away from other citrus. We've been experimenting with about 8 different varieties at the old U of A research farm, and some of them aren't doing so well. Some of them are okay, but they tend to granulate here, which is a real problem because all the individual juice cells rupture and the fruit dries out. So we're hoping some of them grow out of that as they mature. A couple other varieties of mandarins are Dancy Daisy. Typically grown in this area are the 2 Fairchild and Kinos. Fairchild is an early ripening mandarin that is somewhat tart but extremely juicy and a very red fruit. The Kenau mandarin is a much later maturing fruit, comes off in March or April. Extremely sweet. Both of these are somewhat hard to peel, and they both are seedy. So that's a no-no for modern fruit consumers. But they're fun to have because they give you a large variety of flavors over a long maturation period with the different varieties of mandarins. Next, please. Tangelos are a cross between a mandarin and a grapefruit, and there are a whole bunch of them, but typically we don't see many of them. The ones we do see here are the miniolas. Those are the ones that are sheep-nosed or bell-shaped. They come under all kinds of different names, like a honey bell and Florida bell, what have you, just for marketing purposes. The Orlando is a much more rounder, redder fruit, sweeter than the Mineola, which Mineola has a little bit of a tart, sweet tart flavor to it that most people like quite well. But the Orlando, to me, is a much better fruit. The allspice is a very unusual one that you don't see around, and I don't know if anybody's growing it commercially. I don't think anyone is growing it commercially. We have a tree of it in the research farm, and it's really a nice fruit. Tastes a little bit spicy, not aggressively spicy, but it's nice. It's really a different fruit. The fruits are small, has a lot of seeds, but those are Tangelos, mandarin, and grapefruit costs. Okay, next. Grapefruit, lots of grapefruit. They all started out with the Duncan. The Duncan is a white, but it's very seedy, but it's a nice white grapefruit. And then somebody found on a branch that, hey, these fruit don't have any seeds. Well, that was Mr. Marsh. Mr. Marsh named his the Marsh Seedless, which is another white. And that was the typical white grapefruit grown in this neck of the woods for many, many years and doing quite well until somebody in Florida and somebody in Texas found pink grapefruit on their trees. Hey, what is this? Well, one guy called his red blush and the other guy called his ruby. And for years, those were two different varieties, accepted as two different varieties. And then finally some scientists did some tests on them, decided that they were actually just pure limb sports off of a Marsh seedless white grapefruit, and they technically are the same fruit. So you hear them called two different things, but they're actually the same fruit, which is a pink grapefruit. Once the reds hit the market, things started changing. Reds mature a little bit earlier, so they're much sweeter when you compare them with any of the whites, because the whites aren't ready yet. So everybody goes, oh, these reds are much better, and they're prettier to look at. So reds took off like a wildfire, and along with years and years of growing pinks, and then the reds, you can't give white grapefruit away. We had 80 acres of white grapefruit on our farm in the West Valley, planted in the late 30s. Great business up through about the 60s when the pinks came on the market, and then the market depleted itself, and we couldn't give them away in the 70s. They wouldn't even harvest them. And they were wonderful white grapefruit, but there was just no demand for them. Some for juice, but juice prices typically don't make you any money. You have to sell some of your crop for fresh fruit to make any money. The last two on that list, you've probably heard of at least one of them. The Oro Blanco is a hybrid. And they're a hybrid between a white grapefruit, it's the Duncan white grapefruit, and one of the pomelos. I can't remember. The pomelo actually has a number to it, and I don't recall. It's not a common pomelo. But they came out with the two different kinds of hybrids from the same regular horticultural cross. And the Oro Blanco has done much better than the Mellow Gold, because the Mellow Gold tends to be a little bit more acidic or sour than the Oro Blanco. But the Oro Blanco is a really nice fruit. And if you haven't tried Oro Blanco, I suggest you get a hold of some and try them. They're like a pomelo in the fact that they have a thick rind. And it's amazing how many people don't like fruits because they have thick rinds. And like I tell everybody, are you eating the rind? There's nothing wrong with a thick rind. Well, it's just handling a thick rind, I think, that bothers people. I gave a talk to a big garden club in the West Valley a couple of years ago, and this woman would not taste one of my samples. She said, that's a white grapefruit, that's sour. And I go, well, try it, see what you think. No, I know what that is. It's a white grapefruit. And I go, well, just try it. Had a sign there that said Oro Blanco. So she was a nice-looking elderly woman, more elderly than I, shall I say. And She finally reluctantly, she was getting a little bit haughty, and she finally took a taste, and she had to eat crow there for a while, and I felt kind of good, because she said, well, what is this? It's an oro blanco. It's a different name. It's not a grapefruit. It looks like a grapefruit, and people won't buy it. It's a very difficult thing to market, but it's a wonderful fruit. Okay, move on to something else here, please. Next slide. Pomelos. They say grapefruit is a cross between pomelo and one of the oranges, but or one of the mandarins, excuse me, but nobody really knows for sure. Grapefruit seemed to show up in the Caribbean somehow, and it's named grapefruit because it grows in clusters similar to grapes. That's where it got its name, and that was a rudimentary white grapefruit way back when. But the pomelos are fun beasts to have around. They do have a very thick rind. They get to be quite large, and several of them that are okay to grow here are these four that I have listed here. The Matubuntan is kind of a pear-shaped fruit, as is the Chandler. But the Chandler is the one you typically see in the store. It's a pink-meated pomelo, and it's usually kind of sweet, but typically they have a lot of seeds in them. And a lot of seeds along with the thick rind, and the sections are really small. They're difficult to handle. And pomelos, you have to get rid of the membrane between the sections and eat only the meat. And if you eat a grapefruit like that, such as you do when you cut it in half and eat it with a spoon, you're getting the meat only, and the acid, the primary source of acid is in the membrane between the sections. But the best one, I think, is the Tahitian, or the Mauna Loa, or typically called Sarawak. It's a very sweet fruit. It has a little bit of a different flavor. It's hard to explain flavors, but it's a very sweet fruit. Once again, it has a thick rind and a fair amount of seeds, but it's a very nice fruit. Okay, we have the next slide, please. Lemons. Like I mentioned earlier, lemons are the largest citrus crop in Arizona. Can't give you the numbers because I don't know what they are in terms of numbers of acres or tons of fruit that we ship out of here, but there are a lot of them. And lemons go everything from lemon pie to lemon drops to lemon oils and sweet lemon for your teas. And the biggest market is for fresh. Everybody likes a slice of lemon in their glass of tea or their glass of water. And so there's a huge market for lemons around the world. The two lemons typically grown for that purpose are the Eureka and the Lisbon. Primarily the Lisbon. The Lisbon is a little bit more aggressive, not much more aggressive, but a little bit more aggressive tree, and produces good-sized fruit, which they both do, but typically Lisbons, and there are a lot of different types of Lisbons. That's the main variety for lemon production in Arizona. The bad thing about those Eurekas and Lisbon lemon are their aggressiveness and growth patterns. They get quite large, quite fast, and then they have thorns on top of that. So if you're going to go with growing a lemon tree, be prepared to do a lot of pruning with a lot of clothes on, or buy dwarf lemon. Ponderosa is a big old football-shaped fruit. It's more of a novelty thing. People don't grow that much unless you just want to have fun with things. The Meyer lemon is a wild or a natural cross in China between a lemon and an orange, they seem to think, and I believe it was found in China. You may know some of the history of the Meyer lemon. For years it was not to be grown in Arizona because it was a symptomless carrier of the disease called citrus tristeza. So it carried the disease and didn't show the symptoms, and the Department of Agriculture in Arizona would not let it come into our state. But in California, they developed the improved Meyer lemon, or the new and improved Meyer lemon. And through the years, they've proven that that's the only Meyer grown now, and the state of Arizona has backed off and dropped that limitation to importing Meyer lemon to our state. And I think they did that in about 2007, 2008. So Meyer lemon, you see it everywhere. I was at Home Depot the other day and saw a whole bunch of citrus trees, and every tag I pulled up was Meyer lemon. If you're a lemon lover, this fruit won't make it for you. It doesn't have the acid that a regular lemon does, but it's a nice fruit. It turns orange when it's ripe, pale orange, and the meat and the juice is a pale orange. And it's pretty acidic, but a lot of lemon lovers, they don't like it. So if you're a pure lemon aficionado, the Meyer won't do. But it's a small tree, thornless, bears lots of fruit, thin skin, smooth skin, no nipple on the end. They're more ovoid or a round fruit. It's a nice backyard tree for lemons. Okay, next. The limes. Everyone should have at least one lime around here to go with your tequila. And if you don't drink tequila in this part of the world, you should. It's part of our heritage. Just a little every now and then doesn't hurt anybody. Keeps the bugs down. The Mexican lime is the typical one grown in this part of the world. It's also called the key lime. And I see I'm missing a parentheses there. And there is a lot of banter back and forth about, well, they're not the same. Well, they are the same. The deal is where they're grown. If you have any kind of a fruit and you grow it in Arizona and grow the same tree in Florida, you're going to get a little bit difference in taste, size, juice quality, amount of juice, size of fruit, a whole bunch of things. And then if you throw in a different rootstock, that'll really change things. So is there a difference in Florida lemons or limes, which is called the key lime, versus Arizona limes? Yeah, there is, but they're the same fruit. The other guy is the Tahitian lime or Bear's Persian lime, which is the larger lime. And when you go in the store, you see them side by side. You can see the difference. They do taste a little bit different, and the big ones are hard to get into the top of the Corona bottles. So if you want to have the small ones, if you're a beer drinker, gem in your beer, stick with the Mexican limes. They're heavy producers typically. We don't grow them commercially in this country because they're the most susceptible fruit to frost damage. So you can imagine a grower with 30 acres of limes and you get 28 degrees or something for a couple hours and boom, he's out of business. So we don't grow them here because of that. They almost come out of Mexico 100%, both varieties, into our markets here. The other one is the Palestine sweet lime, and you rarely see this guy. And it's a nice oval fruit. The tree is open canopy, and they're pretty strong producers. People from the area of Persia, which is Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, all those parts of the world love this fruit, and the Mexicans love this fruit, but it has what I call an insipid flavor. Very juicy, ovoid fruits, size of small oranges, but you bite into them, you get a burst of very sweet juice, and then it goes away instantly, and it just tastes like it's washed out. But when you take these things into a market where Mexican people typically shop, or people from Persia area, they go out of their way to get these. On the tour, there's John Baviar's place, the Greenfield Citrus Nursery. He's got a couple of trees. He has about 20, I don't know if they're Iranians or Iraq people, every year come there and almost get into fist fights over these fruits. Because he just has a couple of trees and he charges them dearly for them, and they love it because they can get them. But it's a hard fruit to get hold of. Okay, next one. Kumquats. Kumquats, I just mentioned limes being very sensitive to frost. Kumquats are the other end of the spectrum. These guys are the real tough guys in the citrus industry. They can tolerate frost more than any of the other citrus varieties. And a couple of them typically grow in the area are Nagami and Miwa. The Fukushu is another, it's a little bit sweeter to me, kumquat, and a larger fruit. The Miwa and Nagami are small, but they're really fun fruits. That's the fruit that you kind of crush between your fingers and you eat rind and all, seeds and everything, just pop them in your mouth like candy. So they're fun to have, also in the respect that their leaves are very, very dark green all the time, and they have these little fruits all over them all the time, most of the time. So they're a pretty tree. They look kind of like little Christmas lights on an evergreen tree. So they're fun to have. Okay, next slide, please. Citrons. Citrons typically aren't grown, but they're gaining in popularity primarily because of that one at the top, the Buddha's hand. The Buddha's hand, I'll show you a picture of it here in a second. Very unusual fruit. If you haven't seen any of them, I was going to, typically I would bring a sample, but the freeze last year, I had 2 Buddha's hand trees. It killed one of them and took all leaves off the other one, and I pruned it back, and it's barely coming back. So that frost really is sensitive on Buddha's hand. But it's a citron. And citrons are grown not for their juice or for the meat, because they have very little meat in them. Those cute little things everybody, no, I don't know about everybody, but those cute little things that people put in fruitcakes, little orange, green, and red and yellow squares, those are made from the rind of the citron fruits. And citrons are like big lemons, but they have very little meat in them. They have very, very thick rind and very little meat. And the meat is not very good tasting. So anyway, they go through this process of chopping them up into little squares and soaking them in brine and acid and coloring them, and they end up in citrons in these little jars you put in your fruitcakes. That is primarily the diamante, which we don't grow in the United States. The etrog, or the esrog, is a forgot what I was talking about here for a second. It's a citron, and its primary purpose in the world is it is revered by the Jewish religion as the first fruit of the world. And so they use it in their celebrations, the etrog or esrog, or they also spell it E-T-H sometimes, ethrog. And so this is a lemon-looking fruit, and they just hold it with a piece of unopened date palm frond, a piece of river willow, and a piece of myrtle. Those are the four things that they have to have for their celebrations during Sukkot, which is Rosh Hashanah time. And I'm a Catholic, so I don't know much about this, but I was one of 2 growers of this crop in the United States, so I know a little bit about it. The trouble is with this fruit, if you're trying to get into considering growing it for that particular market, is they don't mind paying $100 for a fruit, but it has to be perfect. So it was very, very difficult to get fruit that was acceptable for their markets in New York. So we're not growing esrog anymore. But that's a fun plant to have. The zest of these fruits is typically used in salads and other things where you use zest, because they get big and they're yellow and they have a lemony flavored zest. The Buddha's hand is fun to have. It is extremely weird fruit and has great aromatic properties. You can take one of its arms or legs and tweak it a little bit, and all the oil sacs rupture and release this aroma into the air. So if you have one in your home, it's probably good for 2 weeks. You can go rub it or move it or tweak it a little bit. Your whole home is filled with this nice lemony citrus aroma. Next slide. And I bagged this off the internet last night and stuck it on there. Unfortunately, when it blew up, it got fuzzy. But that's what our Buddha's hand or fingered citron looks like. Strictly for fun, ornamental. Next. Now we talked about all those varieties and ran through some of them. How do you find what you, once you've decided what you want to buy, how do you find it? Well, this is where a problem becomes at issue, and there are a lot of people out there selling stuff that they don't know what it is, and between growing these things at a nursery and repotting them and repotting them and repotting them, or digging them out of the ground and potting them and getting them into the domestic or the retail market, a lot of tags are misplaced and you don't get the full information of what you're actually buying. I can't give you a percentage of times this happens, but a lot of people have come to me through the years and said, well, you know what, I planted this orange tree and this is not what I got. What are you going to do? After 4 or 5 years, you're stuck. So, try to buy from reputable marketers. Every tree by law in Arizona is to be tagged by the grower, not the marketer. So when you go to Home Depot, they have their own tag on there. They didn't grow that. Somebody else grew it for them. So in the process of taking off the grower's tag and putting on their tag, human error can fall into there and make a mistake and misidentify it. So there's a little risk. They're pretty good at it, but there are some problems. That tag should tell you who the grower is, not the marketer, the grower, what their phone number is. They should have a registration number for that particular tree rootstock combination. It certainly should tell you the variety that it is, and it should tell you the rootstock. So you have a pretty good idea of what you're getting into. Now typically, homeowners don't really worry too much about it because they just want a citrus tree or an orange tree or a mandarin tree, so they buy it. But if you're serious about your fruits and nuts and vegetables and what have you, you really want to know what you're getting. Because 20 years from now, you still living in that house, you still have that tree, you want to enjoy what you thought you should be enjoying. So just be careful. And, you folks are plant people, so you know that you don't buy beat up plants or worn out plants or plants that have been pruned a lot. So just be careful and try to look at the rootstock so you know what the rootstock is. May or may not be helpful to you. Another thing that's real important, not only in the selection of the variety, is the problem with, and I'll talk about this in planting, is the problem with root-bound plants. And that happens with all kinds of trees and other plants. So just be cognizant that root-bound issues are a real problem. These nurseries there are so many people buying trees and plants these days that the nurseries are just putting them out, and they have these huge nursery factories, and some of them are not very careful. A very good friend of mine is an arborist in town, has been for 40 years, and he runs into endless problems with root-bound issues. Down at the bottom, I've got a full-size rootstock, which typically produce a full-size tree, different types. Sour orange is let me talk about rootstocks just for a second. The sour orange is typically the best rootstock for this area. Unfortunately, sour orange rootstock is the most susceptible rootstock to citrus tristeza disease. So, treat. Trees grown on sour orange, you won't find. Now, there is one nursery, John Babiar's at Greenfield Citrus Nursery, grows exclusively on sour orange. And he's of the mind that when the citrus tristeza disease gets here, it might not be virulent enough to cause us too many problems. That's a big if that nobody can. Does it work? Well, this one works. Okay. I'll stand close here. So, being with the university for a long time, we have all of our information based on science. So we know that disease is a real problem. It's carried by an insect, the brown citrus aphid, and it'll probably get here. Will the brown citrus aphid survive when it gets here? Will it bring the disease with it when it arrives here? Will it be able to transmit the disease? Those are all ifs. So to be on the safe side, we're always going to say be careful about sour orange. But in the back room, we're also going to tell you the best thing to go with is sour orange. But buyer beware. That is a caveat with sour orange. Some of the others are fine, but some of these things don't work well in our soils and our climate. They work okay for backyard stuff. Some of the commercial guys won't use them. But I say the Carrizo C35 are fine. Can't see that one. The Vocameriana rough lemon, those produce a more sour fruit. They're fine for grapefruit and lemons. I'd stay away from them on any of your sweet fruits. Troyer is also a very kin to Vocameriana, and I would stay away from it on sweet fruited trees, such as any of your oranges or mandarins or sweet grapefruits. The only dwarf rootstock you'll probably see is flying dragon. I think some big nurseries in California, I'm not sure, I think some of them are using some Cuban shaddock, which is a dwarfing rootstock. And a dwarfing rootstock is you can graft any citrus onto any other citrus, so those rootstocks are just very slow growing, so the trees stay small and probably max out at 10 to 12 feet in their lifetime of 30 or 40 years. By the way, we have citrus growing in the valley well over 100 years old, so citrus will live a long time. It all depends on many, many factors. The soil that's grown in, the care that we humans give it, and all kinds of climatic considerations and what have you. Okay, next slide, please. Any questions on varieties? Yes?
You didn't mention Satsuma. I wonder.
Didn't mention Satsuma. Satsuma is one of the mandarins. Satsumas typically grow in a much more humid climate than we have here. So like I said, I'm just trying to touch on some of the majors. Okay. There are lots. You get into the mandarins, you could choose from hundreds that might do well here. Ugly is a Tangelo, out of the Caribbean. It might do great here. I doubt it, because those things were bred and engineered and spent their whole career in the tropics. But this is not tropical.
Talking about rootstocks, is pomelo a acceptable rootstock?
Is pomelo acceptable rootstock? There has not been a lot of studies, to my knowledge, that pomelo has been used as rootstocks at all in Arizona. They may be used in other parts of the world. Ask Glenn Wright. I'm no longer with the university, but I still say that. He's the rootstock guy. Okay. Planting these trees. Maybe you don't even need to talk about this since you're all plant people, but I'll touch on it real quick. You get plants in any kind of a situation of a container, from a big old box to a huge box to small little containers. I saw some little bitty containers in Home Depot the other day, like 2 gallons or something. Whatever. If you want a tree that's going to give you fruit right away next year, you better buy something that's already big and mature. So you're going to have to pay for it and have to go through the trouble of moving it and getting it in a hole in the ground. Next. Do a water perk test. This goes back to what I first talked about in one of my earlier slides, the first slides, about the condition of your soil. You do the perk test to learn how water moves through your soil. And you can do this, the typical perfectly sized hole, or you can just dig a depression out there and put some water on it and look at it for a while, and just to give you an idea of how water moves through the soil. If you water it up and put 3 inches of water on the ground and 5 minutes later it's gone, you got sand. If 3 days later your pool is still there, you might have caliche. So it just gives you a real rough idea of what your water is going to do, and that's the most important thing to growing plants in this climate, is manipulating the water. Okay. This shows the old university standard for planting a tree. You dig a big hole, you put a bunch of backfill in it, and you tamp it down. I don't recommend that. I recommend digging a hole that the root ball just fits in. And then allow your space just a little bit to run a narrow tamper down in there. Get some water it in, put some dirt around there, tamp a thin layer of dirt, more water, more dirt, and tamp it as you build up. Don't fill up your hole like this slide indicates the middle picture. You tamp only the top. You have to tamp from the bottom a little bit at a time to make sure there's no air pockets in there. Roots don't grow in air. And then put a ring around it or something so you can water around the area so the roots grow away from the trunk, and try to keep your trunks dry. Doesn't matter if the trunk has a foot or so around it of dry ground. Those roots are trying to grow away from the trunk. You don't need your water by the trunk. And a disease we have in our soil here gets into the trunk through the water. Okay, next. Here's how we plant them. We dug them. This is at the U of A farm. We dug the holes with an auger. We dug the trees with shovels and broke the root balls and made a big mess. And we planted them in dry ground with no water. And we tamped them good. But Enrique here has been working for a citrus operation for 20 years and planted literally thousands of trees on their operation. And I have quite a bit of experience. So we did it like this and we didn't lose any. I don't recommend that. That's pretty rough handling, but it can be done. The main thing is you want to get all the air out of your soil around your roots. Make sure your trees are not root bound. If they are root bound, just cut the roots at the all around and in the bottom of your root ball and stick them in the ground. There is another problem that I'm seeing now is a lot of nurseries are taking small plants and putting them in large containers. So you look at the container and the root ball tends to fall apart because there's not a lot of roots out there. And that's because all the roots are inside that small little container that was transplanted not too terribly long ago. So buyer beware. Grab the trunk of that tree and shake it and look at that. Pull the soil back away from the trunk and make sure that that tree is not root bound in tight nor out at the edge of the planter. Also, never plant a tree too deep. The first roots coming out of a trunk should be right at the surface. Any tree planted lower than that is planted too deep, and it will cause long-term health issues with the tree if the trees are planted too deep. So the soil should be right at the first root coming out of the trunk, which is called the root flare area. Okay, next slide. I think I'm probably running out of time. We better clean it up here. You need to wrap or paint the trunks to keep them from sunburning them. And you see all the trees painted white in this area strictly because of sunburning. If it has a large canopy and there's not much sun getting onto the trunk, you don't need the paint anymore.
So a wrap or a paint while the trees are young and not providing shade to the trunk is important to make sure that the trees don't get sunburned. Next slide, please. There's the Buddha's hand next. Irrigation. Once again, that's the most important thing that we need to handle in this environment. Back to that soil thing. Don't need to look at that anymore. We're sick of that. Let's have another one, please. Depth. Roots of a citrus tree, mature citrus trees, 85-90% of the roots are going to be in the top 2 feet. What does that mean? You don't need deep root watering. Anybody comes out and tries to sell you this injection of fertilizers and nutrients down 24 inches, no. It's putting it below the root zone. The root zone is in the top 20, 24 inches, something like that, where 90% of your roots, your feeder roots are going to be. So apply your fertilizers on the surface, work them into the soil or water them into the soil, and that's all you need. Once again, try to keep the area around the trunk dry, water away. You should be watering out by the drip line and out 2 or 3 feet. That's where all these roots are going to be. It's amazing how far roots go from the trunk of a tree, but that's where the majority will be. That's where you want your water and your nutrients. Okay, next. Different kinds of waterings, procedures or methods, it doesn't matter. What you're interested in putting on so much water in an interval. As the summer gets hotter and drier, that interval shortens. The same amount of water, or the water amount remains the same. You just change your interval. As winter comes along, it starts to get cool. Then you lengthen your interval. In the winter, you might water once a month or once every 2 months. In the summer, you might water every 5 days. Citrus does not like wet feet. So water and let it dry out thoroughly, not only on the surface, but down deep. You have to dig down in your soil to know how your soil is holding that water, and then base your irrigation schedule on soil holding capacity. So if it's dry down deep at a foot, you need to water. Okay, again? How are we doing, Alvin? Okay. Next one. Next one. Frost protection, that's pretty basic. You can do a few things, cover your small trees, put a light source, a heat source underneath your trees, water them early in the morning from, say, midnight till 6 o'clock. That's when it's going to be cold. Or you can pray if you want, because sometimes it just doesn't help. Next. Okay, next. Fertilizing citrus. Typically, citrus in this part of the world only needs nitrogen. We're going to fly through this pretty quickly. Get hold of the University of Arizona flyer on fertilizing citrus trees. You can kind of calculate the amount of fertilizer you need. Next. Leaves indicate what kind of fertilizer a tree needs. I can't get too much into this, but the university has a handout that shows this. It's available online in color. Next. Nitrogen, of course, is the one I mentioned. Typically, we do not give trees in this area any phosphorus or potassium. Maybe some minor elements if they need it. Next. Next. Micronutrients if necessary. Next. Now we're talking about the different types of fertilizer available, liquids, solids. You just need to get your fertilizer in the ground on your own schedule that you decide to stick with. If you're going to use organics, that's fine. I don't know much about organics because I don't use too much of organics. And organics are kind of all over the board because they don't have specific ingredient labels that are known to be taken up by the plant. Some do, but they're kind of nebulous, I think. But I think organics are great, and I think more people need to use them. Next. Next. Pests, of course, humans are the top of the line at pests because, start off the bat, these trees don't grow in this environment. So we're forcing an organism to grow in this environment which it doesn't want to grow or normally would not survive. So we're at the top of the list. Thrips are little tiny insects that scar the leaves and the fruit. They're strictly cosmetic. Woodpeckers are bad, rats are bad, nematodes. These other things are issues that typically we can't do anything about, but they don't cause too many problems in our area. Next. This is a thrip and its damage, strictly cosmetic. Next. Woodpeckers are a problem in some parts of the valley. You can't do anything about them except try to scare them away some way. Next. This is primarily woodpecker damage. Next. Ratus is a roof rat problem in some parts of our valley. Hopefully not in your neighborhood, but anytime you have rats living in your trees, eating your fruit, it's a problem. Next. Peel miner is a little insect that burrows under the epidermis of the fruit and leaves a tunnel scar. Next, strictly cosmetic. California red scale, say a little sucking insect that attaches itself to fruits and branches, and we have them in some selected areas of the valley, but typically we don't see this problem here in Arizona. Next. This big butterfly, this is a giant yellow swallowtail. And this larva looks like a great big bird dropping on your branches. These guys eat a lot of leaves, so if you get them, throw them in your neighbor's yard. Next. Next. Diseases, Phytophthora, the soil fungus, prophylactic methods to keep that away from your trunk or keep the trunk dry. I'm out of time here, so just want to touch on citrus greening. I would say Google it. It's a huge gorilla in the room that might get here sometime. It's definitely finding the insects, the Asian citrusilla that carries the disease, but they've not found the disease. You can go to the Arizona Department of Agriculture website and find some information on this, or just Google citrus greening in Arizona and you'll learn all about that. That could be very, very damaging to the citrus in Arizona. Next. This is an alternaria that is a wind-borne fungus that gets in navel oranges and rots the fruit. And you have all these little black beetles crawling around in there, and everybody thinks the beetles are the cause of the problem. They are souring beetles that show up when the fruit is decaying. Next. Pruning, typically we say don't. Go ahead, next, please. We don't prune unless you want to for some reason. If you want to have that tree tall enough so you can set your picnic table and your lounge chairs under, go ahead and prune. Prune judiciously. Don't paint the cuts. Paint bark if you thin your tree out really bad and you have sun exposure. And for large branches, use a 3-cut method. Everybody knows what that is, I'll tell you. When you're going to cut a big branch, you cut it on the top, it's going to rip all the bark off and make a big ugly mess. So cut it on the bottom first, and then on the top. And then that'll fall and break away a clean cut. Then you cut the little stub off for your final cut. That's the 3-cut method. Next. This is the healthy tree without any pruning. Next, please. This is the pruning job that has some good cuts and some bad cuts. Good cuts just take a little more time to position yourself and cut with a pruner or a saw or hacksaw or whatever you have for a tool. And like I mentioned, don't paint the cuts. Next. This is a bad pruning job, but something they do in some communities in our valley to prune these sour orange trees, which are strictly ornamental. But you can see all the frayed cuts and what have you. That just allows a lot more pathogens to get established in there on soft, fresh, clean tissue. Next. This is a grapefruit tree that's been topped and thinned. It will recover, but there's a lot of stuff was taken out of that. Plant and prune as you wish. You see everything in everybody's yard that you wonder, how is that staying alive? But it is. They're tolerant. That's why these trees are tolerant. That's why I have humans as the #1 pest of citrus in Arizona. Next. This is how we do it commercially. We have these big instruments that are made in Israel, believe it or not, and they top and hedge the trees. That little helicopter thing goes round and around, and those blades at the end are going about 9 million miles an hour. Next. Then they push them up and grind them up and make mulch. And then they grow houses where the trees used to be. That's what's been happening in central Arizona a lot. Next. Container growing. That's pretty simplistic. Citrus trees typically try to get large, so you might have to repot quite a bit or keep them very small for the bonsai process. Next. That's a bunch of citrus we show at the annual citrus field days the university has every year. East Valley and West Valley, we display about 90 different types of fruit. Next. That's it. I'm sorry I kind of crammed it. There's a lot of information to do in 45 minutes. Do you have any quick questions? I'm happy to stay. Yes?
Cocktail trees, you have luck with those?
Cocktail trees is not a problem. That's where you graft different types of fruit on one rootstock. And you can do as many as you want. You can have 30 different branches and 30 different fruits on one tree. No problem. The trouble is, those varieties don't grow at the same rate. So if you put lemons on there, they grow much more rapidly and they suck all the energy out of the rest of the tree. So the rest of the tree kind of deteriorates in health while the lemon is good. If you're judicious about your pruning and keep all of the branches uniform size, you can produce as many fruits as you feel like you want to.
Thank you.
Yes?
Some of the odd varieties, any place to buy them?
Odd varieties are hard. Internet searches are okay. I've tried John Babiar's, the guy at Tropical Fruits. He has some strange varieties, but you know, it's market demand. A few people show up and say they want a corrugated grapefruit or whatever, you know, and nobody has it. So you just have to look and look and ask and ask. Yes?
The leaves on each one of the citrus, they are not the same size.
No.
The big leaf covers the small leaf, it kills.
Yeah, you just prune off the big ones. Creates more work.
Well, thank you, James, and it was very informative.
Come on. I'll be right here.
I go to Germany, and I think they imported blood orange.
Oh, yeah?
Chicken downstairs? No. They're selling some grass here, and they've got some trees and plants.
I walked in from the south.
Yeah, no, it's in the north end. The grass area where they're selling some trees.
Okay, right now it's lunchtime, so there's two people at the lunch table. All you have to do is give them your lunch stuff, and they will get your lunch for
I don't
you.
have enough room, so I could. But I have to control.
Yes, that makes more work for you.
Oh, okay. Then also in the Ventana room is a separate room. They're having a taste pomegranate. So if you want to go eat lunch either in this room at the ballroom or outside, but in the Ventana room you can help yourself with the pomegranate taste testing. They also have dates over there to taste and pitaya. Okay, the Ventana room is 241. So if you go around outside of this building,